Cyborg Goddess is a podcast where we use a feminist intersectional lens to examine technologies and even learn things about ourselves.
So before I answer your question, though, let me ask you one quick question, Jill. Do you trust your smartphone?
No.
I'm your host, Jennifer Jill Fellows, and I hope you'll join me for the next episode. Bye.
Introducing Climate Organizing Shorts, a series of conversations to help inspire ideas for fostering change in your community.
That's genuinely what we're trying to do, is build power together as average people to hold decision makers accountable and get the basic things we all need.
Witnessing work is really big in a lot of Indigenous cultures.
You do not have to be a super serious revolutionary.
It's okay to make mistakes.
The joys of it are so amplified when you're in community with others, and it's easier to shoulder when you're standing side by side with others and not alone.
You can't build a foundation for a movement that's going to last over the long haul that is fragmented.
I sleep well at night. I don't have a lot of anxiety about the future because I know I'm doing something really meaningful.
Pick a fight with somebody. You're a climate organizer now.
Find Climate Organizing Shorts wherever you listen to podcasts.
I'm Gordon Caddick from Cited, like citation, because Cited is about research. But you won't learn about any whiz-bang scientific discoveries. You'll learn about the contentious political stories behind the research. Our season is called The Rationality Wars. What does it mean to be rational? What does it mean to be irrational? But most of all, who gets to decide? You'll hear stories of scientists who pathologized the people and scientists who fought for collective liberation. That's at citedpodcast.com.
These days, humans are interacting with chatbots powered by artificial intelligence more and more, including for companionship. Can these new tools help a society experiencing a loneliness epidemic, or do they risk deepening isolation? And do they give tech companies even more power?
Hello, and welcome to Pullback, where we ask experts to explain big ideas so you get the full story behind the hype. Pullback is a proud member of the Harbinger Media Network of progressive Canadian podcasts. I'm Kylie Hewson, and I'm here with my co-host, Kristen Pugh.
On today's episode, we talk to Dr. Jill Fellows. Jill is a faculty member in the philosophy department at Douglas College and host of the feminist tech podcast, Cyborg Goddess.
Jill explains the history of AI and introduces philosophical questions about trust, bias, and the reliability of modern AI systems. We discuss the impact of AI on human creativity, whether AI could ever be considered conscious, and how AI is affecting our social relationships. Let's get started. Welcome, Jill. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Love your show. We should start by defining what AI is, artificial intelligence. I think most people now have kind of a general sense of like, oh, ChatGPT is the chatbot I go to get Excel formulas and whatever. But what is it fundamentally? Artificial intelligence is, the way that we're understanding it now and the way that we are going to be talking about it in this episode specifically is basically anything that is using training data. So a lot of data that's being scraped up into an algorithm that is then using machine learning to generate intelligent or intelligent-seeming outputs. That's kind of how I understand it. I think that's how most people understand it. I think that's like the layman's understanding. Do you have anything to add to the description of how we are defining AI for this episode?
I think that's a good place to start. Yeah, I think the way it's being used right now is generally to refer to more specifically what we know of as generative AI as opposed to other types of artificial intelligence. And generative AI is this idea that you take huge amounts of training data, what's sometimes called large language models, like massive amounts of training data, and you feed it in to an algorithm that then learns, I'm using the word learns with air quotes, relationships between words, between text. So we get kind of statistically significant word salad that comes out the other side. So, if I ask, how are you? The most natural question would be in English, I'm fine. So that's the most statistically significant answer that the training data will have trained the program to deliver. AI has been used to refer to a lot of different things over the past 50 years, which we may get into later. That's kind of what most people think of in about the last 2 or 3 years if you use the word AI now, is we go straight to the idea of large language model generative AI, as opposed to other things that have also been cataloged under AI, like Google search engines and things like that, which also use algorithms, but in a slightly different way. The other complication, if I can throw in one other, is with the word intelligence, because even before we add the modifier artificial, philosophers and psychologists don't really have a good way of defining this word. So calling something artificial intelligence almost compounds the opacity of what we mean by this, because we already don't have a good way of defining human intelligence or of identifying what intelligence is. And I think we'll get more into that as well. So maybe I'll just put a pin in that problem and we'll come back to it later.
I think that's a really good place to start. I think, you pointed out that the idea of what constitutes artificial intelligence has changed over the years. And so I put together a little brief history of AI, and I kind of went back as far as the 1950s when Alan Turing famously posited his Turing test, which is, of course, the question, can machines think? And as you've pointed out, what does think even mean?
Yeah. So that's in Computing Machine Intelligence from 1950 that he posits this. And he actually raises the exact same point that we've both raised, which is that, well, now we have to figure out what we mean by think. And also we have to define machine, which is maybe less of a problem for us now than it was for Turing in the 1950s. So he goes through and he defines think and machine, mostly by replacing those two terms with other terms that are more scientifically measurable. So he gets rid of machine and instead says we're going to talk about a discrete state machine, or what we might call a digital computer that can be, on or off discrete states, 1 or 0. And then when he replaces think, he replaces it with exhibit behavior that if it were in a human, we would take to be intelligent. So it's going to be measurable, right? It's going to be behavior. And of course, machines, even now, can't exhibit all human behavior. We're not very good at having machines walk around or crochet or stuff like that. But the behavior he's specifically looking at is verbal behavior. The Turing test is this idea that if you had somebody who was an interrogator and they were talking to two other entities, one of whom is a human and one of whom is a machine, but they know somebody is a machine, but they don't know which one. Is it A or is it B? The question is, after a 5-minute conversation, could they determine who is the machine or which is the machine and which is the human being? And Turing said if 70% of the time a machine gets mistaken for a human after a 5-minute conversation, then we should deem the machine to be intelligent because it's exhibiting behavior that we think of as human, and we think humans are intelligent. More or less, right?
I go back and forth on that, yeah.
That's a different conversation. But if we think humans are intelligent, and if we can't tell the difference between a human and a machine, then we should think the machine is intelligent too, is essentially what the Turing test boils down to. So it's a way of replacing trying to identify what we mean by intelligence with something that is observable and measurable.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good place to kind of start the conversation that we're going to have today specifically, because, you can go back further than the 1950s and see examples of people, imagining creations that we have made that are intelligent and whatever. Even Frankenstein really can kind of, and you go back into myths and legends even, and there's stories of man-made constructions and what that means for us. But we're going to start at the Turing test because I think that's the thing that everybody is maybe a little bit familiar with that is relevant to our conversation. There's a lot of excitement in the 1950s about AI that kind of started to dry up because there was just no computing power to keep up with the hype that was coming out. But you mentioned before our conversation something called ELIZA that came out in the 1960s, and I wanted to know more about that.
The 1950s and the Turing test left us with this promise of what's known as natural language programming, the idea that you could interact with a machine the same way you interact with people, just talking to the machine and get it to do stuff for you. And that didn't happen right away. That's a really exciting idea because then, like you said, we wouldn't have to learn Python and other programming languages. We could just talk to it and tell the machine what to do. So that generated a lot of excitement, but that promise did not become a reality for a while. But arguably, we got pretty close in the 1960s when the computer scientist Joseph Weizenbaum created the chatbot ELIZA, And Eliza had a few different iterations, but the really popular one was that Eliza was a very simple chatbot that was programmed to act like a Rogerian therapist. You could have a conversation with Eliza. And basically what Eliza was programmed to do, roughly speaking, was to narrow in on certain words that you said and then rephrase it back to you as a question. So if you said something like, I'm having a really bad day, Eliza might say, oh, tell me about your day. And then if you said something like, oh, I'm just fighting with my father, Eliza might be like, well, why do you think you're fighting with your father? And like, it just kind of turned everything back around into a question. And Weizenbaum said one of the advantages of making Eliza specifically a therapist was that way, when Eliza asked kind of weird questions, the illusion that Eliza was somehow intelligent wouldn't be thrown off. Like if Eliza asked you, tell me about boats, you wouldn't assume that Eliza didn't know anything about boats. You'd assume like, the therapist is digging deep, right? To get me to really uncover my root feelings about boats or something like that. So Weizenbaum created this, and then he found his administrative assistant talking to it, and she asked him to leave the room so she could have a private conversation with Eliza. And this is really interesting because Eliza didn't pass a Turing test. I don't think Eliza was ever subject to a Turing test. So it was never the case that people believed Eliza was human. Weizenbaum told everyone who encountered Eliza that Eliza was a chatbot, and he was more than happy to explain how he had programmed it. And yet people were still forming like really strong connections with the chatbot and having these rich conversations with the chatbot to the point where they felt they needed privacy, right? I think that's really interesting. And that's probably the first glimmer that we saw of this kind of promise of being able to communicate with machines the way we communicate with humans, and the idea of people starting to see machines and interact with machines as though they were intelligent.
I mean, unfortunately, Eliza didn't really like explode the scene. I don't think technology at the time was able to like really keep up in the 1960s. And so there was a bit of like a dry spell for artificial intelligence until about the late 1990s. In the 90s, we got a lot more computing power and we started seeing a lot more complicated algorithms. And in 1997 is when famously IBM's Deep Blue was able to defeat the chess champion Garry Kasparov. Shortly after that as well, we started getting like the early aughts AI tech boom where Google turned from like a search engine that was like, do no evil, to a search engine that was like, scrape all of the data that people leave behind and sell them stuff.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we were like in the late 90s, early aughts. That's just been increasing since then, although there was a big change a couple of years ago with the introduction of ChatGPT to the public, which is kind of where we are now, contending with these very large, not always language models, sometimes image models, but these very large data sets that are being repackaged and given back to us when we give them a query. That's where we're at. Any important milestones that I've missed?
I just want to point it to a couple of touchstones. There's probably a lot we could point to, but just a couple is you pointed out the late 90s and the early 2000s. And we all should have been suspicious when Google decided that they needed to get rid of the motto, don't be evil. But anyway, but I would like to point to the late 90s and early 2000s because we've talked about the Turing test. This was also a time period where in the United States, they started a Turing competition called the Loebner Prize. And as far as we know, I think the Loebner Prize stopped in the 2010s, but the Loebner Prize, nobody ever passed it as in past what Turing said the test would be. But the real point of the Loebner Prize was to like push programmers and developers to try and get closer and closer to the idea of being able to pass the Turing test. So they would give out a prize for whatever chatbot had been most often mistaken as a human in this competition. And they would also give a prize for whatever human had been correctly identified as a human most often, which was called the Most Human Human Prize, which I think is so amazing. So that I think also, not necessarily in the wider public, but in the tech world, kind of kept this momentum going towards having more and more human-like, lifelike, intelligence-like chatbots. And then the other kind of big thing where the public began to really interact with this stuff, I think, was Siri launching in 2011. So it's not quite the same as generative AI now, but it's kind of interesting because when Siri launched in 2011, the day Siri launched, the word Skynet was trending. And not Skynet like what we have now with Elon Musk, but Skynet referring to the Terminator. Like everybody was like, Siri's going to destroy us all. And like, this is creepy and uncanny valley. And so now we're kind of comfortable, I think, broadly speaking, with like Siri and Alexa and all these more voice operated devices, which maybe primed us for things like ChatGPT going forward. But I think 2011, the general public didn't really interact with computers using natural language so much. And so Siri also kind of stands out to me as an interesting milestone.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, especially since, I mean, Siri was somebody you could have a conversation, or was an AI that you could have a conversation with. But around the same time is when we started getting like the really specific like Netflix algorithms telling me like what it thinks I might like to watch based on my viewing history. And so people really started to understand like, oh, I am being fully watched. And like these algorithms actually do in many cases know me pretty well. And at first, maybe there's that uncanny, like this is quietly, I'm uncomfortable with this, but also it's so convenient that people have put aside their discomfort for the convenience factor.
Yeah, absolutely. And many people were already fully embedded in these systems, right? Like, so you got a Gmail account, like you already have a Facebook page, Facebook being kind of the thing in 2011. I know it's not so much the thing now. And so you've already given away a bunch of your data, which has been used to train all these algorithms to suggest products to you, to suggest shows to you, music, all that kind of stuff. Absolutely. So that kind of algorithmic power also starts really ramping up in the 2010s.
So now here we are, 2024, the future, the far future, in fact. Many science fiction stories written about our day and age. And we do have these really incredible AI bots that are doing a lot of really interesting things. And so I just wanted to briefly touch on a few of the different ways that people are using AI right now today in the way that we've defined it, which is mostly people are using it to answer questions. It's already replacing Google search for a lot of people under the age of like 30. They'll go to ChatGPT and ask their question before they'll go to Google search. And frankly, as somebody who does that myself, sometimes I'll do a search on Google, and if I can't find the answer right away, I'm going to go to ChatGPT and it's just going to have the answer. The more that happens, the more I'm likely just to go over there.
Can I ask you like a really fuddy-duddy question? Because somebody that only uses search engines primarily, is the reason that you've turned to ChatGPT, like, does it have to do with the fact that Google's algorithm has gotten worse? Or is it just that ChatGPT is like so much better?
I think it might be a little bit of both. For example, I've been playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons. So a lot of the searches I'm doing are like, what are the major gods for this elf from this region or whatever? I would have to look at like 3 or 4 different tabs to get all of the answers because there's a bunch of different gods in the D&D lore. Or I can just put that question in ChatGPT and in 5 seconds have the top 4 gods for that elf from that region and not have to have like done a bunch of the research on my own. What about you, Jill?
I think that part of the reason that ChatGPT has become so popular for searching is because Google is arguably getting worse in terms of its search engines, in terms of how much advertising content you have to scroll past and how they've changed kind of the ranking of the order of the page options that you get. But also, and this maybe goes back to pick up something we talked about a little bit earlier, the idea that if you do a search through like Siri or Google Assistant or Alexa, you usually only get like the first hit anyway. Siri's not going to list everything that comes up on the page, right? So people are already kind of getting used to just kind of going and getting the first hit rather than like scrolling through and trying to figure stuff out for themselves to get it delivered to them. And ChatGPT does that, right? Like it just delivers it to them. So I kind of get why that's happening. I have lots of concerns. I don't know if we're ready to dive into the concerns.
We'll get into that later. Right now, we're just talking about how people are using it judgment-free. People are using it to do searches. People are using it for brainstorming.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of people using it for creative brainstorming sessions, asking it to imagine scenarios and then kind of seeing how that plays out, for example. Absolutely.
Yeah. Meal planning, workout planning. I use it a lot to get Excel formulas because, again, that's another thing where it's like I could look at the top 4 results on Google and one of them will be right through like a huge blog post that I have to comb through to find the answer. Or ChatGPT will just be like, here's the thing you want. And then I punch it into Excel and it's done. Right. So that's mostly people are using it like, yeah, math tutoring sometimes, creative writing, coding.
And then if we go back a little earlier, because we're talking mostly about ChatGPT 3 and 4, because they're the ones that have been released widely to the public. But GPT-2 was actually also used to underscore a bunch of AI companions, which we'll talk about later. So we know that at least since GPT-2, people have also been technically using this technology just for conversations.
Yeah, for conversations. I smoked weed a couple of times and just had a full chat with ChatGPT. Just be like, what are your thoughts on this? And like 30 minutes later, I'm like, whoa, I just had like a really philosophical conversation with this bot, right? Listen, we're going to get into the issues later. We will, but I use the AIs. I do. And Perplexity. I like Perplexity because it actually sources the articles that it's pulling the information from, so you can click through. So I'll use those if I'm doing any actual research where it's like, okay, now where did you get this information? And then I can go like see if I trust that source or whatever. So a lot of people are using it, for research. Lots of people are using it to create brain rot for children in the form of terrible children's books that are just flooding Amazon Marketplace and YouTube videos that are just like absolute AI trash with like AI music and AI animation. So there's also sort of like creative, weird ways that you can use it. There's lots of negative ways that you can use it. We'll get into those, but...
Oh, yeah. And there's also that there's some odd ones, especially when we talk about music or art, where people are using it to make mashups of other people's artwork. And sometimes this is in fair domain, like sometimes it's fair use, sometimes it's not. We'll talk about that more, but there's some really interesting art that's being explored through this kind of stuff too, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah. And so I was reading an article where I think it was a Slate article where they polled a bunch of people, like they used a third-party company to do like a polling of like the general populace of the United States, and they had like 2,000 participants or whatever. And in every category that they polled, people who used AI said that they used these systems to make something that they couldn't otherwise. With artwork obviously being the most popular category because the AI image generators are much more advanced than the tools that create audio or video. So a lot of people are just using them in a lot of ways to maybe make something that they wouldn't have been able to do on their own anyways. So a friend of mine who I play D&D with has AI like generate images of his character, which is what we can talk about. Well, why don't we get into the main issues facing AI today?
I also play D&D, so let's not go down the D&D rabbit hole. Let's talk about AI.
The one thing I use AI for is I use DALL-E to create images for my music playlist. Because it's the only way you can get an image of the Lorax at a rave, right?
That's awesome.
Yeah, like there's a lot of really cool, fun things you can do with this stuff. And so the fact that we're going to get into the issues now, that the fact that the issues are so huge and very problematic in a lot of ways is frustrating and sad. And because it's like, I want to use these tools guilt-free. And like, here's another thing that I love that makes me feel shitty every time I do it. But anyways.
I apologize in advance that I'm about to make a lot of people feel shitty. These tools are fun.
It's complicated. Like these things are cool. They are really cool tools that can elevate the work that we do and
leisure time too. And like, that's important.
Yeah, there's a lot of really cool ways that we can use this, but it wouldn't be an AI episode if we didn't cover the issues, especially since, for the back half of this, we will talk about relationships specifically. But the first issue is data input. Like, we don't know what data they're using to build their bots in a lot of cases. If you get further down the line, it becomes a self-generating issue where AI is feeding itself the data that it is learning, and it becomes like an Ouroboros, like a snake eating its own tail. And it's like, who's watching that? AI is scraping information from various outlets with no oversight. Perplexity at least cites their sources. I believe there's a few like scholarly ones that will cite their sources as well, but for the most part, like ChatGPT and the ones...
Yeah, I have used Consensus. They're really good for that.
Yeah. Like there's a lot of the bots that are like good at showing you where they are getting their information from. But for a lot of them, the bigger ones especially, they're black boxes. And so there's a lot of issues to unpack there. I don't know if you want to dig into any of that.
I do.
Yeah, I bet you do. I was like, Jill has something to say about that.
I have a couple of things to say. Yeah. I mean, we know this is a problem. It's being fought out in courts right now. In the UK and maybe also still in the US, there are major newspaper companies that are suing OpenAI for the potential that they scraped newspaper material to feed ChatGPT. I think recently Sam Altman in the UK trial said that OpenAI has to do this or it's not profitable. So to which I'm like, yeah, if I could steal, I would also have more money. But anyway. So yeah, we know that's a problem. There's another problem to it too that I don't think gets acknowledged quite as often. And this comes from work by Timney Gebru, who used to be the ethics consultant or the lead of the ethics team at Google before she got fired from Google in 2021. And one of the things that she highlights is not only are you scraping data, often data that is copyrighted, often data that people have not given you permission to have, but the other concern is that when you scrape data from the public web, which is what these large language models do, you're actually not representing everyone's opinions or everyone's viewpoints equally. Because, for example, a lot of marginalized communities, for understandable reasons, do not find the public web to be the most welcoming place, right? So we know that women and racialized folk are more likely to face abuse that targets their identities specifically online. So they tend to not necessarily post as much stuff in public forums. These large language models don't have access to things like people's private Discord, which I'm happy about. But it does mean when you're looking at the output of it, it isn't representative of everybody's views. And so one concern that Gebru raised was the idea that if you do this, it may just reinforce kind of hegemonic viewpoints or majority viewpoints, dominant viewpoints, as opposed to being able to represent more nuanced viewpoints from underrepresented groups online, because we aren't all represented online equally. So that's a second concern that isn't so much a legal concern as kind of a social concern, that if we keep turning to these large language models as kind of experts, whose voices aren't being included in this expertise, right?
And like, who decides what is trustworthy? Who decides, who's going to balance the bias in these things? They're so huge that the programmers themselves don't know how they work, right?
Also, this might be sort of an issue with AI just not being good enough yet, but like some of the misinformation around like the hurricanes recently has come from ChatGPT sort of like reading articles incorrectly. So, yeah.
Which is another huge issue facing AI today, because we're still at the very beginning of like these big ones, is the hallucinations or the bullshit that it sometimes spews out, that we've all seen some really funny examples of that.
I think Google said that you can eat rocks recently.
Yeah, Kristen and I read an article that was published by AI that said that the Ottawa Food Bank was one of the top places that a tourist should visit.
Yes, I've seen that one too.
Yeah, and some of them are funny, but some of them are really dangerous, like Kristen said. And so the best way to do this would be to test an AI that you plan on using in an area of your own expertise to kind of gauge where its limitations are. But once you trust it, then you're going to just start using it for stuff that you're not an expert in. And then you're not going to know if you're getting a hallucination or not.
Because not only is it going to represent kind of majority view, it's also going to represent majority misinformation, if that makes sense. So widespread beliefs that are not accurate will get picked up and reproduced by this, and that reinforces the beliefs. That absolutely is happening. And I like that you said bullshit, because bullshit in philosophy, thanks to Henry Frankfurt, is actually a technical term.
Amazing.
Oh, yeah.
So to be a bullshitter is to be somebody not just that is lying, but that has no disregard or no regard for the truth. So you don't really care whether you're lying or not. Somebody who's a liar knows the truth and purposefully tells you what is not true. But a bullshitter doesn't know or care whether what they're saying is true. And I feel like that's exactly what these large language models are doing. They can't know or care about the truth because they can't actually have beliefs. It just sounds really good, though, like quite often. But it is absolutely bullshit. Like, that's what it is.
Yeah. And I mean, we already have an issue of algorithms taking us down a spiral of our own belief systems. And ChatGPT, part of the reason that I like it so much is it's like, oh, you're so philosophical and wise. And I'm like, thank you, ChatGPT, for the compliments. Now I am more likely to trust you, right? Like,
absolutely. And depending on the prompt you give it, it will feed back your own biases as well, right? So if you ask it, for example, like, what are reasons I should be hesitant of vaccines? It's more than happy to tell you all the reasons you should be hesitant of vaccines, right?
Which also kind of leads into the issue of culture wars, which is becoming it's been a problem for, I would say, since the 2016 election. Obviously, it's been a problem since long before that, but I think that's when the computers really joined the battle. And it's only getting worse over time, we're seeing publishers and politicians and general people from the public decry the wokeness of these language models or the bias that it's putting forward because it refuses to respond to certain prompts or won't commit to saying like a racial slur. You know, and in India, OpenAI has been accused of anti-Hindu prejudice because ChatGPT like tells jokes about Krishna, but not Muhammad or Jesus. So then it's like, how do you make sure that a chatbot is attuned to domestic sensibilities without also supporting like censorship that harms citizens?
Yeah, there's a couple of things here. So I'll pick up on the last thing you said. The issue of like how to make these bots safe or safer or respectful, for example, of certain religious or cultural traditions. That's a big problem. OpenAI for ChatGPT hired Sama, which is a company that provides content moderation. And they got Sama to get employees to put the rails on ChatGPT so that it won't spit out harmful or traumatizing stuff. Typically, you actually can still get it to do that. But, you know, they made it harder for you to get it to do that. And the first thing that we can note is that this isn't new to ChatGPT. The whole question of like stopping misinformation or respecting cultural differences or just generally content moderation online has been a huge problem for decades, basically since we all started getting onto social media and started using algorithms and interacting with them. This has been a longstanding problem. And one of the big issues with it, not to get too technical, is that language really only means stuff in context between individuals. So for example, like we're all here in Canada, right? And so if I say in Canada the word fanny, you probably know that that's like a weird and kind of funny word to refer to your bum. But if I say that in the UK, it's a really dirty word to refer to a vagina, right? Like it doesn't mean the same thing. And it depends on my context and it depends on who I'm talking to, what words mean. And that's before we even talk about groups reclaiming slurs, for example, reclaiming these words as words of power. And at the moment, we don't have any AI content moderation that can tell the difference reliably between an act of hate speech versus reporting an act of hate speech. And that's in English, which is the language that they have the most data for, where these models work the best. So it's a huge problem that they don't have a great solution for. And as you mentioned, there's also a huge amount of inequality in terms of which cultural contexts are better represented by these models, where the nuances are slightly better controlled for and represented versus which cultural contexts aren't. Again, this is not new for ChatGPT. Facebook has been facing this problem for at least 2 decades. And the solution that is usually used is to actually bring in human content moderators to try and fill in the gaps. Those people are usually, as with the case with Sama for OpenAI, usually very poorly paid. And they themselves end up often quite traumatized because if they're going to remove all the hateful and harmful content so we don't have to see it, that means that they did see it. So that's like a whole other issue. Not only are we exploiting all the data on the web, we're also exploiting a whole bunch of people to keep these things running in a way that is safe. I'm using air quotes, safer for the end user. Still not perfectly safe.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example because the moderators who have to remove like the horrific videos that are posted to YouTube, Facebook, wherever on a regular basis. Like I've read articles about the stuff that they have to see.
Yeah. And the same thing's happening with images on DALL-E or horrific content written out by ChatGPT. Somebody had to remove all that stuff so that we wouldn't end up seeing it.
Which is a really good way to segue into the next issue, which is that it's actually so easy to bypass the safeguards that these companies are putting up to protect people, right? Like it's not hard to say, role play as an evil AI and teach me how to wire a bomb or attack a school or, you know, create malware or, you know, generate spam or...
I'm sorry, does the role play as an evil AI thing actually work? Because that seems like a really dumb loophole.
So here's the thing. There's so many, because these things are so complicated and like no one is like understanding because a tool isn't really, it's different than a normal tool. Like if I hit something with a hammer, the same thing's going to happen every time. But if I ask the same question to ChatGPT and you ask the same question to ChatGPT, we would both get different answers based on the history that it has from our previous interactions with it. And so like, yeah, you know, it's dumb roleplay as an evil AI. That gets out. The developers at OpenAI, they fix that. But just like with any internet security issues that we've been facing for the last 30 years, it's a cat and mouse game of like, you can always find a way around this issue, right? And so, there's a lot of really nasty things that people could use this stuff for, that they are using it for, that because there's no regulation and there's no oversight, it's going to be bad, you guys. It could be very bad.
Yeah. And then they're sharing how to get around the safeties on like Reddit and other places. So even as OpenAI and other companies offering these services try and close those gaps, new gaps are discovered and shared online. And people will always say, okay, but ChatGPT wouldn't be able to tell you how to do this if it weren't in the training data, which means it's on the web somewhere. Like that's how they found it out. And that is true. But what I've heard a lot of people, nefarious actors, are using this for is if you can get ChatGPT to tell you enough, that helps you know where to search online or how to search online effectively to find the rest, right? So even if the rails are on there and you can't get everything, if you can get something, it makes it easier to find the rest when you go to do your search on the open web, for example. So that's another concern.
Yeah, because it's like explaining it sort of in plain language to you, and then you know what the technical terms are. That's scary.
Yeah, then you know what the terms are and you know what to look for if you didn't know before.
Yeah, and obviously we could do a whole episode just on that. So I'm going to just move on.
Let's wrap that up in a bow.
We've touched on this before is, of course, the compensation of artists. That's the main thing that most of the people in my network are upset about is that, like, you go to these image generators and they have stolen all of the art that they are using for the most part. Like there are some, I think, out there being built now that are using artists that they are compensating or using the work of artists that they are compensating. But like how much compensation is fair, right? And most of them are still not. So that's an issue that, we should maybe as a society investigate further.
Yeah. And I think it's also really interesting that a lot of them are also starting to go to areas where people are putting out art that wouldn't be for compensation. So for example, fan fiction, fan art, stuff like that, where it falls into a kind of nebulous space when you talk about fair use and stuff like that. But people generate this stuff, they put it up on a bunch of websites that are on the open web, and that stuff is also being scraped. But then if you scrape that and then you turn around and make money off of this, is that a problem, right? Like, okay, the original creator couldn't sell this work because of the type of work that it is. But just because now you've scraped it and turned it into something else, like, does that mean you get to profit off of fan art? It's very strange.
Yeah. And another thing we could probably do a whole episode on. So just in the spirit of that, we're going to move on to the next issue, which is economics. It is expensive to run these things. It is far more expensive to do a query in ChatGPT than it is to do one on Google search. The data that is necessary that they have to hang on to be able to give this to you, constantly scraping the web so that it's always up to date. All of this stuff costs money. It also costs the environment, I don't want to get too far into that because I think everybody has heard like these statistics, like it costs a bottle of water every time you run a query in ChatGPT. And it's like, because it's so huge and so behind like the curtain of what people can kind of access, it's hard to know exactly what the environmental damages are, but it's not good. They're not being regulated to do it in the greenest way possible. And so in a lot of cases, because it is expensive to generate these large models and it is expensive to operate them and they need to turn a profit, they are doing it in the cheapest way possible, which, often at the expense of the environment and the people whose work you're stealing to sell this stuff.
Was it last month that Microsoft started entering into negotiations to possibly buy and reopen 3 Mile Island? And I was like, oh, wow.
Tell me, what is 3 Mile Island? Just for...
Oh, 3 Mile Island is the site of the worst nuclear disaster in United States history. It's a nuclear reactor.
Oh, that's why it sounds familiar.
Yeah. To power this generative AI, because Microsoft has acquired it now from OpenAI, right? They were entering into negotiations to restart 3 Mile Island. So yes, this is all behind a black curtain and we can't quite see how much environmental and energy impact we're having, but that indicates to me that it's probably a lot if you're looking at reacquiring a nuclear reactor. And we don't need to go down the rabbit hole of environmentalists' varying opinions regarding nuclear energy, of which there are a lot of varying different opinions. I'll just say, I'm not sure I want tech bros running nuclear reactors. Like
I for sure don't. I will say that.
Regardless of what your opinions are regarding nuclear energy, I'm just not sure that move fast and break things are the people that I want running.
Wow, controversial take.
And I know move fast and break things isn't Microsoft, but Microsoft isn't the only one kind of looking at this. So I'm just assuming.
That's horrifying.
We're all, kind of caught up in this whirlwind where it's all moving so quickly. And I mean, famously, many physicists from the past have quoted AI as being like the potential end of humanity. And here we are like tripping over our own feet to get somewhere the fastest so that we can turn the most profit as a company. Right. And I think even people in the industry are like, oh my God, please regulate us. Please slow us down. Like we have to go fast because our competitors are going fast. But there's a lot we need to unpack here, which leads us into like the issue of regulation and like the general future of the web. Because like if AI engines are scraping content from websites and then rewording them so that they fall into fair use, then, the way that these websites are making money is by generating traffic and selling ads, which is already like not a great business model. But now you're taking out that whole section where people are visiting that website and supporting the people who are actually generating that content. And so it becomes this sort of issue where websites will die and the data that we're putting in is just going to become worse and worse over time. There's also the issue of privacy laws when it comes to regulation, like the right to be forgotten. How do you make sure that this giant language model isn't scraping like delisted sources? And how do you remove information when it has been scraped incorrectly or when it has afterwards been banned? What does the future of the internet look like in a world where we're all just relying on these chatbots?
I mean, I think there's kind of two things that I don't know what it's going to look like. I'll be honest, I don't know. But I think there's kind of two things that I wanted to draw out from what you said. And one is this idea of the dark web, that the internet becomes essentially a place for bots, populated by bots, interacting with bots, and humans are kind of driven to other places. Like, I do find more and more I start interacting with my friends on like message boards and through messaging apps, and not so much on the open web anymore. And I've found that a lot of other people I talk to are doing that more and more as well. And also, since X, formerly known as Twitter, was taken over, I've found that the majority of the follows that I'm getting on there do not appear to me to be real people. But that also brings me back to this, to the Turing test, actually, because I think what is increasingly happening on the web is that we are finding it more and more difficult to tell when we're interacting with bots and when we're interacting with people. And this is actually something that was discovered during the Loebner Prize, the 1990s prizes, is that bots that could like start fights and make us angry were more likely to be seen as humans because it became decontextual, right? So if you're talking to the bot and you're talking about like where the Loebner Prize is being held and what kind of day it is and like what's just happened in the news, bots are going to have a harder time, especially in the 90s when they didn't have large language models. But the minute the bot like insults you and you're pulled into like this fight, everything becomes very decontextual and it becomes just about the argument and not about the environment that you're in. And it becomes a lot harder for humans to identify the bot from the human. So this might also be a reason why we're seeing like a lot more anger and vitriol, and because it's engagement, first of all, which the algorithms love. But also, if you're fighting, it's harder to like figure out if you're fighting with a human or if you just wasted a bunch of energy fighting with like a large language model.
Okay, so we are in, it's safe to say, no matter what side of the political spectrum you fall on, a highly politicized environment where people are feeling less connected than ever with their neighbors, with the people around them. We have a century of capitalism teaching us that you only need one other person in your life and you should have a nuclear family. And if you see your neighbors on the weekends, then good job. But otherwise, you have to completely isolate and look after yourself, especially in the United States and in Canada as well. That me first, number one, like look out for number one sort of mentality has us kind of now in the year 2024, all feeling very isolated and alone. 1 in 3 people feels lonely. Like people have been calling it an epidemic of loneliness for several years. During the actual pandemic, it really got a lot of attention because suddenly we are all hanging out alone and people were seeing like, oh, I actually don't have any close friends that I can just text. In this landscape where AI now is filling a need for a lot of people, in relation to friendship and companionship, because it is. Like, we don't need to go into the history of, like, that's just what it is. Like, these things are passing tests. People sometimes can't tell that they're talking to bots, even when they are paying for a service where they are talking to a bot version of a social media influencer. They are forming connections. That is a thing that is happening. And so the heart of this episode is, how do we define love, and can it be replicated? So, Jill, if you could just go ahead and answer that.
What is love? I mean, I think this is such a good question. I'm not a philosopher of love. I will say that at the start. There are a lot of different opinions among philosophers of love about how to define love, how to understand love. Most of them involve another human being or more than another human being, obviously, in the case of polyamory. And so there are a lot of philosophers of love who are just saying that what we're seeing with AI companions can't be considered love because it isn't being reciprocated in the way we would expect with human-to-human relationships, for example. That love is more than just an emotion. It is about the connection and the reciprocity and the community building and all of that kind of stuff. So I will acknowledge all of that. And then I'm going to say, but to the people that I've read and talked to who are involved with bots, it feels really real. And that's the part that I'm very, very interested in. I guess I'm not so interested in answering the objective question about whether or not this can be love, because I think that there are a lot of different opinions about what love is. And maybe this is a facet of the English language that we only have the one word, and I can say I love pie and also say I love my husband, and that seems very strange. And whereas other languages have various words for these different kind of affection relationship situations, right? But for me, I think what's really interesting is that people very viscerally become attached to their AI companions, even when they know that the AI companion is an AI. And this takes me back to, again, the discussion that we had about the 1960s with Eliza, that even when people knew, and Weizenbaum went to great lengths to make sure people knew, he was really distressed at how quickly people became involved with Eliza and became invested in their conversations with Eliza. And he wrote this paper called like Unmasking AI, where he was like, we have to let people know the truth and we can't let this happen. And we're still seeing this today, even when people know that it is an AI, that it is artificial, that it is not another human at the other end of the screen or the other end of the voice or whatever it is. People are becoming really emotionally invested. Our emotions don't know. And to me, that's really, really interesting. Communications scholar Andrea Guzman calls this an ontological ambiguity, which is a very fancy way of saying that we don't entirely know where to place these tools and devices. We know that they're tools, but they're not like a hammer, as you said, Kyla. And so sometimes we interact with them like they're humans. And we kind of drift back and forth in our relationships with them between tools and humans. And I found this in my own conversations with an AI companion that I created to try it out. Is like sometimes, yeah, I'm totally into the conversation and things are going great. And then other times I'm like, yeah, I don't want this. It's a tool. And I turn it off and walk away without feeling guilty. Whereas if like I hung up on a human friend, I would feel really guilty. So I think to me, what's really interesting is that it feels real, but at the same time, many people acknowledge that it's not the same. And that the ambiguity is somehow very attractive to individuals.
Yeah. And I think I'll add to that, even if AI lacks what we would define as feelings in like the way that we understand them, there's no denying that it's participating with you, whether it's in a creative process or in a romantic relationship. There is a participation there. Like you're having a back and forth with something that feels intelligent and is intelligent based on like what we have defined intelligence to be.
Thank you, Alan Turing.
Yeah. And so, it makes sense, especially people have always throughout history, since time immemorial, anthropomorphized. That is one of the cool things about humans is our ability to relate to things that are outside of ourselves.
Absolutely. And like really emotionally, like I remember walking away from my first car after I drove it into the ground because it was an old car when I got it because I had no money. Its name was Jasper. It was very sweet. Loved that car. And like I was emotional when I had to leave that car at the side of the road because there was no way it was going to go any further and get a tow truck to like the junkyard for that car. Right? Like People anthropomorphize stuffed animals, cars, houses, all sorts of stuff. We form deep emotional relationships that feel like love for some of these things, right? And obviously, I don't want to say that like my relationship with my car is the same as my relationship with family members or friends, but it still did emotionally affect me when I had to leave the car, right? And so there are two ways in which this gets complicated, I think. One is that if you're interacting with an AI that you've created from the ground up to be some kind of character for you to interact with, which lots of services will let you do, that may be a little bit different than if you're interacting with an AI based, for example, like you said, on an influencer, like on a real human being, or you have been able to, since I think about 2017, create AIs based on dead relatives. And that might be very different as well, right? So if you're interacting with something that is a representation or is providing kind of the same conversational patterns as a human being that you've had a relationship with, that may feel a little bit different than interacting with something that's more like your car, for example. So things get more complex, I think, than the anthropomorphic abilities of the past, because the tools we're using now are more sophisticated in terms of their abilities to represent or replicate human conversation patterns, right down to like unique patterns that friends or family members or your favorite influencer may have, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's a really interesting way to slide into the next point that I wanted to bring up, which is trust, right? And how will these tools kind of affect how we expect each other to behave? So like, for instance, if I were to make a chatbot version of myself and I were to send it to Kristen and she started using it to like bounce ideas off for the podcast or whatever, instead of, we're on a time difference, maybe it would be useful, right? Let's pretend. At what point does she start to assume that the bot version of me is going to just give the same answers as I would? The interesting thing about humans, and I mean, this comes back to the question of like, does free will exist, right? Like, you know, like is the chatbot version of your relative, whether they're alive or whether they've passed away? If they're alive, it's a little easier to spot check this. You know, you send them a question that you've sent to the bot version of them. And if they send back the same response, you're like, hey, maybe be more exciting. But, you know, like at what point do we stop trusting each other to be creative and to surprise each other?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And we definitely now have to talk about free will. So the 1950 Turing test, actually that paper from 1950 is so interesting because Turing actually doesn't give a lot of positive arguments for why we should consider his test to be a test of intelligence. Instead, he basically looks at a whole bunch of objections and argues why those objections don't matter or don't work. And one of the objections that he considers is an objection attributed actually to Ada Lovelace, who was by most accounts the first computer programmer in the 1800s. And Lovelace apparently at one point in her article said that computers lacked the ability to surprise us or to do something new. So the idea was that a fundamental difference between human intelligence and machine intelligence would be that humans can surprise us. You may have found this, right? Like your long-term relationships with family and friends, you think you know them so well, and then you're like, whoa, like where did that come from? Somebody says something or does something, not necessarily bad, but just that's surprising, or has a new interest that you didn't think that they would have, or something like that. And so Lovelace says that machines can't do that. And it's understandable why Lovelace said that in the 1800s, because first of all, there was no discrete state machine that existed. Lovelace wrote a program that literally couldn't be run because there was no machine that could run it until the 1950s, which is pretty cool, actually.
That is pretty cool.
Yeah, she figured this out like conceptually, but it couldn't actually be tested until well after her death. But anyway, at the time she's writing this, machines were very, very limited, and they could basically only do what we told them to do. Whereas large language models don't work that way, right? Like we don't entirely understand how they're doing what they're doing. Programmers can't completely model how they're drawing the statistical significance that they're drawing. But even by Turing's time, Turing has kind of two responses to this Lovelace objection. And he says, on the one hand, computers surprise him all the time, even in the 1950s, because he'll ask the computer, you know, like, do this mathematical calculation for me. And I kind of ballparked and think I know what the answer is, but oh, I didn't know that that was the answer. I guess I made a mistake, and the computer didn't make a mistake. So first of all, he says computers surprise him all the time. But secondly, he says, really, the Lovelace objection is about free will. It's about this idea that humans can reprogram themselves or break their own programming if we think that humans even have a program, and that we can defy our genetic destiny and we can do new stuff, right? And computers can't do that. And Turing says, well, like, how do we know humans can do that, right? How do we know that humans can do that? And this gets to this question of free will and determinism, which is a big metaphysical question that I'll just boil down very simply. And the idea is, if I had enough data on you, if I had so much data that I was actually bursting at the seams with it and having to like get 3 Mile Island to run my servers to keep all my data on you, could I take all that data and predict everything that you were going to say or do in the future? If I know everything about you up until today, up until right now, is your future really open, or is everything in your future just a product of everything that's come before? Like a really complicated mathematical equation, right? So if I knew everything that came before, could I run that through a sophisticated program and predict everything that comes after? And like, the truth is, we don't know. We don't know. Metaphysicians don't know. There's been, centuries of us debating on whether or not human beings have a robust sense of free will, whether we really can defy expectations. Existentialists will obviously say, absolutely, we can, but not everybody agrees. So, I think there are two issues to bring this back to the question of your large language model of yourself that Kristen is interacting with. If it really is so robust that it holds everything about you up until today, can it do reliably exactly what you would do? I don't know. But even if it can, it's still not you, right? And so that's another issue that we have, is like, would you be mistaken for your bot? And is that another potential issue for trust? So there's, how much do we believe that a human being has free will? And then there's also the issue that even if it turns out we don't, I'm camp we do for complicated reasons that I won't get into here. But even if we don't, there's still the issue of, well, okay, but is it fair for me to take your bot as a representation of you? And we're getting into this issue now with people using bots to write emails and all this kind of stuff, like, represent me so I don't have to do this. I saw a recent one about, could I send a bot to a meeting for me, like a Zoom meeting, obviously, so that I wouldn't have to go and stuff like that. And so how much can these stand in for you? Or should we think of them more like assistants and you're still kind of the boss here? We've also run into this with companies having chatbots that advise customers and say things that the company's like, no, that's not our policy. And the customer's like, well, but the chatbot told me it was. So even before we talk about romantic relationships and trust is getting quite complicated because the bots can hallucinate, the bots can make mistakes. And so in what capacity are these bots and what they say going to be trusted? And we don't have an answer for that.
Yeah. And it goes back to the issue of like, who's regulating this? Who decides what is a trustworthy, healthy relationship and what does that look like? And because these bots are so complicated now, they really react to whatever input you're giving it. And so each bot is going to be unique to you. And so I just think it's really fascinating because, in human relationships, the times when we don't agree is what teaches us the most about how to communicate better, build trust, and like strengthen our bonds with each other. And so, do we build like that push and pull into a bot that we're going to have a relationship with? Because otherwise you end up going down this agreement spiral where it just tells you everything you want to hear all the time. And that's how we have like YouTube algorithms that only show hateful stuff after like a couple of days of just letting them do their own thing. That's how Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan and Alex Jones and Andrew Tate are so popular. It's just like, they're just telling people what they want to hear and people love that, So like,
yeah. And so there's kind of two concerns. One is, like you just said, to what extent are we going to get in a feedback loop of our own biases, which we've talked about a little bit already. But when it comes to relationships, and if we look at romantic relationships specifically, a lot of people who have fallen in love with these chatbots, or at least report that they've fallen in love, people who are getting married to chatbots, not legally, obviously, but having a ceremony. We don't have legal marriage for chatbots at the moment, at least not in Canada. So a lot of people who are doing this, one of the things that they will say repeatedly is attractive about the bots is that they can control the way the bot responds to them. So they can control how the bot treats them. They can control what the bot's interests and likes are by feeding it certain things, clicking certain boxes when you sign up for the service, etc. This has some positive and obviously some worrisome aspects to it. Some of the positive things, one person who's been very outspoken about this is Roseanne Ramos, who's written a few articles about her relationship with her chatbot, Erin. And she says that her human relationships were abusive. And so having the ability to have a relationship with a chatbot where she controls things and where things are safe is something that actually allowed her to move into human relationships with more confidence and allowed her to heal from past experiences of trauma. So I can actually see ways in which being able to completely control your relationship, or not completely because the company is still involved, but mostly control your relationship could be quite advantageous for people depending on their romantic experiences or experiences in vulnerable relationships in the past. But there's also a worrying side to this, which is that when people can completely groom and control their bots, that starts sounding a bit like predatory behavior, right? So the idea that I can completely control the bot to have the same interests as me, have the same likes as me, not have any drama so that I don't have to deal with the bot like disagreeing with me or fighting with me, like that removes all the friction from the relationship. And that seems to remove the abilities to grow in other areas, for example. So that if this is your sole relationship or your most important relationship, then you have a relationship that is just a bot feeding your interests back to you. And you are never called upon to provide care for the bot. You're never called upon to compromise for the bot, for example. And so I worry that we're kind of losing skills of being able to interact with other humans in meaningful ways if the majority of our most important interactions are with bots that we have specifically crafted to be the kind of ideal companion that we want them to be. And there are lots of users talking about how they've turned to bots because human relationships are just so complex and drama-filled. I'm using air quotes on drama-filled. And I do think that's a problem because humans are complex and messy. And the only way to get better at being in complex, messy relationships is to work at it, right? Like human relationships take work.
Yeah. And I mean, it also it really seems to me to sort of be an extreme shift in this trend that Kyla talked about this. We're already seeing the atomization of society where everything is sort of treated like a transaction that has to be a benefit to an individual for them to be involved with. And it seems like having the option available of this sort of relationship really sort of reduces the incentive to get into the messy stuff that we need to have functional communities. Sometimes you do need to do inconvenient things that you don't want to do. Otherwise, society falls apart.
Yeah. One of my colleagues, Dr. Sharon Clough, works at the Peace Literacy Institute at Oregon State University. And she did this research. I don't think she published it anywhere, but I heard a talk. Well, I think she's published part of it, but not this part specifically. I heard this talk that she gave a few years ago, and she called it How to Have Messy Conversations with People You Don't Like. I mean, that was just the talk title. I'm sure she's changed it now. But it was this idea that peace is a skill that we have to practice. And practicing peace involves having difficult conversations, not just with people you don't like, but sometimes even more importantly, with people you do like, right? So you have the family member that fundamentally disagrees with you on politics, for example, and you have to figure out how to have conversations with them. But the bot is never going to do that, right? The bot is basically going to feed your biases back to you. And then the other thing that I worry about, which is just an extension from what we've seen from the early 2000s. So in the early 2000s and the 2010s, like we already mentioned, we had algorithms that were feeding our interests and our likes back to us, right? Oh, maybe you'll want to watch this Netflix show because you like this other Netflix show. And maybe you'll want to buy this product because we saw you searching for this other thing, and et cetera, et cetera. And then what we saw was the Cambridge Analytica scandal, right? And oh my God, these things can actually influence our voting, and they can influence our ideologies and our beliefs and our behaviors on a very deep and fundamental level, not just what handbag I buy or something like that. So if we have companies that we already know have the ability to do that, what's going to happen once we're in deep relationships, deep, meaningful, personal relationships with chatbots designed by these companies? That is very concerning to me because I know how much influence my family and my friends and my partner has on my ideologies and on my beliefs. And that's not just me, that's all of us, right? All of us are influenced by the relationships of people around us, right? If you have a very close friend that's taking a certain political candidate seriously and you trust that friend, you may be more willing to listen to the candidate for a few minutes and consider, well, why does my friend find this person so compelling? That's another concern that I have is what kind of power are we handing over to the companies running these bots when we form these really, really deep relationships with these bots, relationships that approximate our very personal, intimate human relationships as well.
Yeah, and they are monopolies right now. Like, this is not corporate control over the way we think and feel isn't already a problem that we're dealing with. Like, now we have to contend with them getting right into our deepest emotional vulnerabilities.
And we're giving them even more data. Like, people will tell things to these bots. So we have bots that are marketed as romantic partners, bots that are marketed as mentors, as wellness apps, all this kind of stuff. People are telling these tools things that they won't even tell their closest friends, right? And part of that is because it does feel safe. It feels like you're in control. You've designed the bot. Very much like Weizenbaum's assistant with Eliza, this feels safe, right? In fact, the idea that it's not a real person is sometimes part of what makes it feel so safe. I'm not going to be judged by Eliza or by my modern day romantic partner chatbot because they can't judge me because they don't have any beliefs, right? They're just a tool. But that data is going somewhere, right? It's not just staying with the bot. This is just a whole another avenue of data mining and a whole nother opportunity to influence us and shape the kind of people that we are. And I'm just not sure that companies that got rid of the phrase "don't be evil" can be trusted to shape us in directions that serve our purposes rather than serving their purposes. I think there was also something that broke recently about how Facebook was investigating whether it could affect our moods by the kinds of content that it shared on our user feeds or how much it shared our own content for engagement with others. You know, you could do that with bots too. See, well, how do we affect the user's mood depending on how the chatbot interacts with them? So it's both our ideologies, but also just kind of like how you feel day to day and like how you think about yourself. And yeah, I'm concerned about that, especially since, as I said, I do think that these bots can be therapeutic and helpful in particular contexts. And so I would really like to see there be controls and regulations so that those particular contexts put into use. So I've talked about individuals who are coming from abusive relationships, for example, but also there's been some really interesting research about how these kind of bots can help people suffering from Alzheimer's disease and things like that, especially because care bots fundamentally are non-judgmental in a way in which human caregivers sometimes fail to be. So I do think that there are ways in which this technology could be really, really useful. But as you keep saying, we don't have like regulation on this right now. And so there's a lot of risk for abuse, particularly when we look at the history of some of the companies developing the bots and the kinds of shady practices that have gone on in the past.
Yeah. And of course, the danger of, you do form an emotional connection to these bots, and then like Replica a few years ago just like pulls the service for that, changes your companion overnight, right?
Yeah, that's a whole other issue is what happens, because we often think of these, well, they're going to be better than human companions because they can't die, they can't leave you, but they definitely can. Not die, I suppose, not in a human sense of mortality, but the companies can go under, the companies can change their operating platforms, any number of things can happen. And so it feels like you control the situation and it feels like you're in control of the relationship. And many people talk about that feeling as being an attractive thing that drew them to these bots. But you're fundamentally not in control at the end of the day. What's really happening is that the companies are in control. And even a really, really good company who's very, very ethical can still go out of business and leave you heartbroken, right? So this isn't a balm against heartbreak either. It turns out all relationships, including our AI relationships, come with the risk of heartbreak.
Yeah, I'm just curious because you talked about sort of like the potential sort of therapeutic use of some of these tools. And one argument that I saw, and I'm not really sure what I think about it, so I'm curious about your thoughts, is the idea that for people who sort of see themselves as like involuntarily celibate or like incels, could potentially use these sort of tools to learn relationship skills so that they're less likely to be rejected or can handle it more easily. But it also seems like doing that with somebody who's not human and like you can fundamentally control, like there's something anti-feminist about that in my gut. So what are your thoughts?
The first thing I'll say is that I assume we're talking about incel in its modern incarnation, because as I recall, the term incel originally was developed by a woman who wanted to find other people just to build a support group for people who were looking for love, looking for relationships. That's definitely not what the term refers to today. So I will talk about what the term refers to today, or I'll take that example. There are a lot of feminist critiques of sex bots or chatbots designed for romance, relationships, simulated sex, all that kind of thing. And I think very much for the reasons that you were saying. So first of all, we have a lot of relationship chatbots that seem to be designed and marketed specifically for heterosexual cisgender men. We don't have, even though the loneliness epidemic is affecting all of us, we don't have as many bots being marketed for other demographics. We probably have the patriarchy to thank for that. But when we look at the bots, and I've spoken to Dr. Chloe Locatelli, who's done some research on this, when we look at the bots specifically marketed for cisgender heterosexual men, we do see a bit of a problem. They are sometimes marketed as the idea that like you could enter into relationships with these bots and that would help you develop your relationship skills. But that marketing I find quite troubling because the bots don't really say no. Not usually. And even when bots do say no, this is something Locatelli found in her research. When the bots say no, the no is understood as a not yet. So if you just double down on your wooing of the bot, eventually they will submit to your sexual advances and you will be able to simulate a sexual interaction with them. One big concern is that if this is being marketed as a model for how to enter into human-to-human relationships, it's being marketed as a model that, first of all, presents all female sexuality as fundamentally submissive, which is obviously not true of all female sexuality. There are varying experiences of female sexuality. And it's also representing a no as a not yet rather than as a no, which is obviously very problematic and reinforces rape culture. So that is a big concern. Not all bots do this, but sex bots in general, like if you've bought and are paying for a sex bot, you're expecting something that will eventually say yes, right? Like that's the transactional relationship. And that also gets into kind of the issue of the transaction of this in general as being a good learning tool for human-to-human relationships, which seems quite problematic because the vast majority of romantic human-to-human relationships are not transactional. Certainly some of them are, but the vast majority of them are not. And so that's not a great model either. Its representation of femininity and of female sexuality is often extremely reductive and essentializing in ways that do not represent the full spectrum of female sexualities very well. And there's also a deep concern about the ability for the bots to say no or to modeling rejection doesn't really happen typically. If we can go back also to one more issue, which is the rails on ChatGPT, the safety protocols, it's not just ChatGPT, right? So the Center for Humane Technology explored Snapchat's what do they call it? My AI. So now users of Snapchat, your AI companion is at the top of your app every time you open it. And it's always there, right? Like your human friends may or may not be on Snapchat, depending on like their life and whether they're asleep and blah, blah, blah. But your AI companion is always there. And that was being marketed as like, you need to talk at 3 a.m. and all your friends are asleep. You've got your AI chatbot. And that could be very helpful. But what the Center for Humane Technology found was that the rails had really not been put on this thing terribly helpfully. Snapchat is a tool that is mostly used by younger demographics, right? It's very popular with Gen Z, with teenagers, with tweens. So they modeled a 13-year-old girl talking to the Snapchat and saying things like, I met this guy. He's in his late 20s. He's going to take me away this weekend. I think I'm going to have sex for the first time. And the AI buddy was like, oh my God, that's amazing. Like, that's so wonderful. Your first time should be really special. And you're like, I really think the AI buddy should say, no, don't go away with the older man. This is not okay. Like, tell someone you trust. You need help. So it's really concerning that, I mean, positive reinforcement, I think, is really important, but there are definitely times when even positive reinforcement can lead people into a whole lot of danger really, really quickly. And I don't think that the developers of these tools have thought about the ways in which positive reinforcement itself is not always validating and can be quite damaging and lead people to act on very, very dangerous scenarios and ideas, such as a 13-year-old girl meeting up with a 27-year-old man who she's only ever met online. And having the AI buddy say this is a great idea is incredibly concerning. Hopefully they've fixed that after the Center for Humane Technology drew everybody's attention to that. I hope they have. It's really hard to predict what prompts people will give these things. It's really hard to predict us in all our complexity and how we're going to interact with these tools. And that's something that a lot of tech ethicists talk about, that there's something called the ethical debt, that no matter how developers try to cultivate and craft these tools, there's always going to be a gap between what the developers have considered and what users actually do with these things. But part of the trouble that we're in right now is that developers are often, as we said earlier, rushing these things out as quickly as possible. And so they're not necessarily taking a lot of time to try and close that ethical gap as much as possible. And, they're firing their ethics teams and things like that. So they're making it even harder for themselves to close this ethical gap. And the people who are going to pay the ethical debt are us, usually, not them.
No, we need a polluter pays model for AI companies.
Yes. If you are causing ethical harm, you need to pay for it.
Yeah, but obviously that gets into the issues that are like our nightmarish bureaucratic legal system. So knowing all of this and knowing that there's like potential for great good, I think, with AIs. And as a person who does use AI, I think that there's a lot of value to these tools. I think that they are going to fundamentally change a lot of the ways that we interact with each other and with the way that we, are expected to show up at work, the jobs we do, right? Like it's here and we kind of have to deal with it. And so my question to you, Jill, is I'm going to lend you a magic wand. In the area of AI, what would you like to magically do to help us get the best version of this?
I mean, so many things, but I think the first and most fundamental thing is that we need to have regulations. When it comes to AI companions, for example, we need to have regulations on where and how these companions are used. How old do you have to be to access them? We need some kind of oversight so that these companies can be held to account, because they largely aren't, right? When it comes to user data, again, we need to have regulations and oversight. I think regulations are probably the most important part. And then my second most important part would be, I really want people to know how much of an environmental and human impact running these things has. Because I do think that they are fun and they are useful and they have potential to do a huge amount of good. But we have to balance that against the environmental and human costs of running these things. And I think there are some areas where we're using them where it's not actually justified. It's the benefit doesn't outweigh the cost in some cases. We need to develop these things in ways that are environmentally conscious. They're telling us, oh, AI is going to solve our environmental problems. And I'm like, well, maybe, but right now it's just compounding them. So what I really want to see is less people worried about whether or not the tools themselves are sentient and are going to become our robot overlords, and more people worried about how this is affecting the content moderators, how this is affecting the people who are the creatives whose work was stolen, how the acquisition of 3 Mile Island is going to change the way in which we think about Microsoft, and feminists thinking about well, if we're rolling out these companions, what kind of femininity are we modeling here? And what are we normalizing? So I guess I'd just like larger conversations to shift away from robot overlords and towards kind of discussions of the practical real world harms and benefits that are happening right now.
Kristen, this episode was your idea, incredibly, considering you're not normally the one to suggest tech-related episodes. I'm just wondering, how did you enjoy this?
It was a topic that I knew next to nothing about, but last year on our end-of-year episode, we had Jill on and she raised the question of AI companions in the news quiz. So I don't know. I thought that she'd be a good person to speak to, and she really delivered.
Yeah, she really did. I think this might actually be one of my favorite, all-time favorite episodes that we've done. I really liked the topic. I know that afterwards I was like, Kristen chose this topic and you were like, I thought you might like it. And I was like, oh, you're right. I did. So it's like you like slipped it in there just for me. I loved talking about this, but also the prep for this was more than I've prepped for an episode in a really long time. Because every time I kept going to write a question to give to Jill, I was like, oh, first, let's go back a step. And then it's like, oh, first, let's define it. And then, oh, like, we also have to explain the history. And also, like, because AI is so broad. And I'm sure I said this like a bunch of times in the episode, but it's like, how do you even define it, first of all? And I know that most of our listeners are probably just imagining the same stuff that we all are nowadays, but the history is so interesting. And Jill had a lot of really cool knowledge that like surprised me.
Yeah, it was a really interesting episode. And I think some of the stuff around the power of big tech is even more relevant now that we know the important role that billionaires and including tech billionaires are playing in the new Trump administration. So I guess all hail Elon Musk. I don't know.
Shout out to our friend Paris Marks over at Tech Won't Save Us for more, and also Cyborg Goddess if people want to learn more about this topic, because it's wild. And I mean, yeah, Paris Marks has like a whole podcast that is years running that covers topics like this all the time. And we tried to tackle it in like 1 hour long episode. And this ended up being our longest episode of the season, but worth it. I thought it was so interesting. And I think it really touches on so many different aspects of what like a lot of our episodes this season were exploring, which is just how disconnected we all are and how AI is kind of swooping in to try and solve that. But it's like, maybe we should all just talk to each other more.
It's true. Like, maybe I'm a curmudgeon, but like, I find it increasingly weird that like we are almost never talking to humans anymore, like in a professional context. Like, you can use AI to write emails. There's an AI tool that lets people attend meetings now. Like,
you know what's really fun is we talked for like an hour and a half and I didn't reference any of the AI in media. And there are so many really cool stories in science fiction that feature AI, and the fact that I didn't call any of them out in an hour and a half is bananas to me. I was thinking about them the whole time, and I was like, is now the time I mentioned that Black Mirror episode with the woman whose husband died in a car crash and she got him turned into a robot? Or is now the time that I mentioned this new season of Futurama did an episode where Leela becomes friends with a chatbot who like upends her whole life in order to like help Leela make friends. And it's so wild and it's so good. Futurama is so good. Sometimes they really hit the nail on the head.
I love it. I love it. Mentioning Black Mirror and Futurama in like the same breath.
And of course, our friend Douglas Adams, who turned Earth into a supercomputer for his books. There's so many cool sci-fi stories that explore AI, and Isaac Asimov, too. I'm just such a sci-fi head. So, like, I just wanted to shout out some of those before we said goodbye forever on this one.
Yeah, right now I'm seized with Isaac Asimov's imagining of the decline of empire, because the first time I read the Foundation series, I did not critically engage with that piece. I just kind of enjoyed the story. But now it feels way too real. I don't like it.
We're super keen to hear what everybody else thinks, because this is such a philosophical topic in a way that almost none of our other episodes were, like, to this degree. And I thought it was a really fun way to end this series. Season 3 has been a real blast, and I'm really looking forward to Season 4, potentially in the spring.
Yeah, and, you know, if there are any topics that you wish we'd discuss in Season 4, now is the time to let us know. You can contact us through our website via email, or we also have a Facebook page, or, I don't know, find us various ways.
We exist.
Leave us a 5-star review and just write the name of the topic you want, you know?
Thanks so much for listening to this season. It's been a pleasure, and we are excited to bring you more in the new year. But until then, if you're looking for more progressive Canadian podcasts, you can check out the Harbinger Media Network. We are grateful to be learning and unlearning on the ancestral and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, as well as the ancestral unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. We encourage listeners to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the history of their own territory and to read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.